Yeah, well, thought that if we were going to start off talking about money, we really ought to see what the foundation of our faith says about money. So, Jesus and money, but it's a strange topic because when we think about money in the time of Jesus, it's best to think in terms, like we think about credit cards, not because they had anything like Visa or MasterCard, but because they understood coinage with as much vagueness as we understand a piece of plastic. How does the magnetic strip work? Who actually holds our money? How do the transactions travel between the shop and our account? And and what is the interest rate we're liable for if we go into credit? Uh, by Jesus' day, coins had been used for about 6 centuries. That's King Atis of Lydia in modern day Turkey. He first made coins in about 600 BC. But uh, at that time, they were of mixed value, literally, and people still hadn't quite got used to them. Uh, to start with, they were made of electrum, which is a mixture of gold and silver, but the mixture is in varying quantities, so the value of each coin is rather uncertain. But his son, Croesus, of course, he became fabulously rich by being transparently honest, because he used a new method of refinement to create coins which had 99% gold. Uh, when you heat electrum to 800 degrees along with some sea salt, which is quite easy to get hold of, the silver separates off as silver chloride deposits. And then you can use those deposits as well to make silver coins. So you can make pure gold and pure silver coins. And for the first time in history, an exact value could be said to be held by this coin because they're pure gold or silver and they have standard sizes. So technologically, this was as impressive as, well, inventing the first Bitcoin. And the seemingly magical technique of refinement still fascinated people in the first century, as seen when the New Testament used it as a metaphor for personal purification. About that time, Chinese were also introducing money, though their coins were in the shape of small daggers and spades, perhaps indicating the two main sources of wealth, that's farming and fighting. They also made a useful innovation. They put a hole in the middle of the coin so you can string together 100 coins. That saves counting. But the icing on the cake came almost literally when Alexander the Great imprinted his face into coins. When he conquered Lydia in 334 BC, he inherited the technology. So he was able to purify coins as well. And his coins spread throughout his empire, that is, throughout the ancient world, from Greece to India and almost to China. And that was arguably the most successful advertising campaign in history because his name and face became known universally. Almost everyone owned a picture of him. Uh, but also it transformed commerce because the same standard exchange was accepted everywhere. So the complex bartering system was replaced by coins, which were easy to carry and hard wearing, and they didn't get sick like chickens or cows. The Romans copied Alexander's coins with new faces and spread them even into Britain. And they made their use compulsory because everyone that they conquered had to pay a poll tax. That's the tribune capitis, capitis being your head, 1 denarii per year from every male over 14 years old. So suddenly, even if you lived your life in a village by bartering with each other, you had to get hold of a coin. Now, that's as transformative and unsettling as if a country decided that every homeless person had to have a bank account because all welfare payments were going to be electronic. Now, in Roman times, many poor people in rural communities would have found it difficult and expensive to get hold of even one coin because they never sold anything for coins or bought anything. They would, in effect, have to buy a coin to pay their poll tax. And no doubt those selling them would set a high price on those coins, knowing that the buyer was desperate, helpless, and ignorant. Now, fortunately, by Jesus' time, Israel was relatively sophisticated. Uh, Markets were common, merchants traveled through the land. There was even a strong export economy. So the the Romans, they were hungry for pickled fish and spices and olive oil and even religious books. So there are many coins in circulation at the time of Jesus. Even women in Jesus' day were allowed to buy and sell on their own in the marketplaces. So individual farmers could sell their produce in exchange for coins. So coins were around, but there was another difficult problem. The Romans, by demanding this new tax, it's a relatively small tax, which had to be paid in a coin. Let me tell you why it's just a small tax. Merchants already had to pay taxes. They paid toll taxes. People paid a poll tax. Merchants paid a toll tax every time they crossed the territorial border when going from one country to another or traveled through a city such as Samaria. Uh, they would pay a tax. That's what we now call a tariff in every single newscast at the moment. And so if you had a delivery of fish from James and John's hometown in Bethany, they had to leave Philip's tetrarchy, cross Antipas's territory, that's in western Galilee. They had to cross in Samaria, south of there. Then they had to come south again into Judea. And they also had to pass through the cities of Samaria and Shechem, who also charged these toll taxes. So that's 8 custom points at 5% each. So that bundle of fish, 40% of the value of the goods would go in taxes. Actually, when the Romans took over Judah and Samaria as a single province, they halved the number of places where that toll would be taken because Roman cities didn't charge tolls and because they pulled together different areas to be one. So the Romans did a good thing there. There's less tax. The amount you paid in poll tax was a tiny percentage of that toll tax, the tariffs, because uh, a denarius a day, that's the wage for a day laborer, that's the tax that you paid for the whole year. So that's roughly well, there's about 200 work days in the lazy Jewish calendar because they had so many festivals. So it's about 0.5% of your annual income had to be paid as that tax. I'd love it if my tax was 0.5%. And they should have loved it because it's much less than the merchants paid. But there was a very big irritation which caused riots. The poll tax was hated because all conquered people had to pay it, but Roman citizens didn't have to. When the tax was introduced in Judea, there were thousands killed in Jerusalem riots. That's after the census of Quirinius, just after the birth of Jesus. And the anger was still simmering when they showed Jesus a Roman coin as a trick question in the temple, when they said, "Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not?" And they handed him a denarius. That's the coin used for this tax. And so he asks, "Whose face is on the coin?" And when they say Caesar's, his response is unanswerable. In that case, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. Now, does that mean that Jesus didn't really care about money? Well, he certainly cared about the money changers in the temple. His disruption by turning over their tables that day was probably the last straw that sealed his death. Uh, the Pharisees had already started plotting to kill him while he was still in Galilee, but the priestly Sadducees, they had enough clout to persuade the Romans to use their power of execution. They also had more to lose because the temple made them rich. The priesthood had two fairly sophisticated accounting scams in the temple. The first was that the contracts they wrote for merchants supplying wood and oil, etc., for the temple, they set the price at the current market value. But they said if the market rate went up, they would still pay the old lower price. though if the market rate went down, they'd pay the new lower price. So they always paid the lower price, and presumably the priests would pocket the difference. The second scam was the temple tax, an annual rate of 2 denarii or half a shekel per adult male. Nothing wrong with that rate. That had been set by Nehemiah. But the priests demanded that the people pay using coins minted in Tyre, because they were 95% silver, whereas the Roman coins were only 90% silver. So you get an extra 5%. And that meant that money changers, who which was the only place where you could get these coins made in Tyre, they could charge more for those coins and presumably shared the profit with the priests who allowed them to set up shop in the temple. Jesus hated those scams, though surely the temple needed money. Actually, the problem with money wasn't that they had too little, it was that they had too much. They didn't actually know what to do with all the money they had. Every now and then, a priest came along and took 3 scoops of coins from the big stash of coins that arrived in the offerings, and that would pay for everything that's needed in the temple for the next few months. And no one knew what happened to the rest. The rabbis did discuss this. They wondered, what happened to all those coins that weren't used? And they came to a rather naive conclusion that with that gold, the walls of the Holy of Holies were gradually thickened every year. Well, it was common knowledge that the Sadducees, who were mostly priests, lived in luxury. So this is somewhat confirmed archaeologically by the luxury of the house, which has been reasonably identified as that of the high priest Caiaphas, which even contained a lump of purple murex dye. That's the dye made from snails by which you made your purple robes. That's more valuable than gold, and it was just lying around, presumably lost among the rubbish. I suspect that most people in Jesus' day just didn't understand how money worked. They knew that they got paid, and they knew that people made more money by giving it to bankers. Just by giving it to a bankers, they got more money. They understood that because, well, we see it in the parable of the talents, the pounds. In that parable, that involved a talent of gold. That's about 80 pounds of gold, which was literally as much as a man could carry. That was the original definition of a talent. So that was completely outside the experience of normal people. They had no conception of how you could make that much money. But it did say that if you put money as into the bank, you would get interest on it. And Jews did already have a concept of this because they had a concept of treasure in heaven. And they reckoned that the treasure in heaven produced interest. And it's the interest that you could spend on earth while the capital stayed in heaven. So they believed that wealthy Jews were wealthy because they were such good Jews. They had vast treasure in heaven, which produced lots of interest as evidenced by their wealth. That's why they couldn't believe that a wealthy man wouldn't get into heaven. His wealth was already proof that God had rewarded him. And Jesus disagreed with all that. He said, store up for yourselves treasure in heaven. And sorry, he instead of continuing with, and God will pay you interest on earth, he continued with, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So Jews did understand the concept of getting interest, but they probably had no concept of how it occurred, except perhaps in some miraculous way. Just as with many people who have a savings account today, are still equally vague about where their interest comes from. In those days of wonderful ignorance, the Emperor Nero managed to get away with the biggest bank heist in history. In 64 CE, he devalued the Roman coinage by mixing in some base metals, and this netted him roughly 10% of the whole world's coinage. Because as the coins wore out and they were gradually melted and replaced with the ones bearing his face, he minted 10% less silver or gold into those coins. We know the exact date from which he did that by analyzing the coins of the time. And of course, in later centuries, other people copied his example, but never with such universal success as Nero had. And yeah, few people have uh, attributed the consequential inflation that happened just after that. Few people realize that was due to Nero. But Jesus wasn't ignorant about money. If you look at his parables, about one in five include a mention of monetary value and coins in some way, such as finding the dowry coins, or discovering buried hoard of money, or paying coins to help the injured Samaritan, or paying for the day laborer, or the threat of a debtor's prison, or finding a valuable pearl, or the two debtors who can't repay. So many parables include money. And those stories and sayings suggest Jesus wasn't against money itself, but what he did decry was mammon. Now, the normal term for money in Aramaic was kesef, that's money or silver. But when money had a negative connotation, they used a different word. They tended to use the term mammon. And that distinction was important to them because they regarded money as wealth and a blessing from God. So they wanted a different word that they could use when money had to be distanced from God, when it was seen in a negative light. And the gospel writers didn't have a Greek word that expressed money in a negative light. So they simply transliterated the Aramaic word mammon. So Jews in Jesus' day distinguished between good money and bad money. After all, wealthy people were made wealthy by God. So they didn't see anything intrinsically bad about wealth. And their wealth was a special form of interest. So there's nothing malign about the system of getting interest that would later be castigated as capitalism. But they did also recognize there was bad money, which they called mammon, and Jesus referred to it in his Sermon on the Mount. No one can serve two masters, for either he'll hate the one and love the other, or he'll be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. There's that famously difficult parable where Jesus praises a dishonest manager who's fired. So on his last day, he ingratiates himself to his master's rich clients by reducing their invoices. Jesus doesn't praise that method for making friends by mammon, but he points out that this man was wiser than the religious people because they didn't even bother to make eternal friends by mammon, let alone by pointing them in the right direction. Luke's clearly fascinated by this term mammon. It might have been new to him because he comes from a Gentile background, and he places Jesus' two other sayings about mammon immediately after that parable, including one which isn't preserved elsewhere. If you, then you have been not been faithful in the unrighteous mammon, who will entrust you true riches? Uh, Luke adds that word unrighteous to describe mammon because though Matthew, as usual, doesn't add any explanation, presumably because his readers are closer to Jesus' Jewish roots and they already knew the word. When we look in rabbinic literature of Jesus' time, we can see mammon being used in that negative way. When they're talking about paying fines or compensation, they tend to use the term mammon. So the Shemites, who only existed before 70 CE, so they're from Jesus' time, they refer to a woman's divorce compensation as mammon. And then there's another law which uses mammon referring to the compensation for damages. And that must date back to temple times because it's a law which is talking about should you also bring a guilt offering along with that compensation. And guilt offerings, of course, weren't available after 70 CE. And you do occasionally find a more moral saying about mammon. So Eliezer ben Azariah, he's a very traditional rabbi in the first century. He argued about someone, you are like someone who maximizes mammon, but really you're causing the loss of life. And we do also have a saying by Monobases, the king of Adial, Diabene. Oh, dear, dear. That's down in the south near Idumea. He generously helped the Jews during a famine in about 45 BC, and he was publicly criticized by his relatives for giving away the family fortune. So he responded, "My ancestors stored up treasure below, but I've stored up treasure above. My ancestors stored up treasure of mammon, but I've stored up treasures of life." Of course, this reply wasn't recorded till later, so we can't be sure of the actual wording, but that usage of mammon is consistent with the earliest witness, which happens to be in the Gospels, of course. Unfortunately, in some Bibles, it's still just translated money, which is entirely misleading. The NIV translates mammon as worldly wealth for two of those three occasions where Jesus refers to mammon. That's fairly close to the original meaning of the word. But like almost all modern translations, when it comes to Jesus' best known saying, it says, "You cannot serve God and money," which isn't what Jesus meant. In fact, at that point, William Tyndale decided if the gospel writers can't translate this Aramaic word, but simply transliterated it, well, he'd do the same. So he has, "Ye cannot serve God and mammon." And of course, those words survived into the King James Bible, along with 85% of William Tyndale's wording. So that keeps a distinction that Jews and Jesus made between money which can be good and useful and mammon, which wealth can be bad. So Jesus was both for money and against it. And it's not too difficult to distinguish between the two, not only by his use of mammon. He says about the person who didn't put his talents to work was castigated by Jesus, who said he could have at least gained investment interest from the money, which implies he wasn't against using money in this way. But he did also tell a parable of a rich man in hell speaking to poor Lazarus in heaven, suggesting that, yeah, even the rich can be bad, unlike the ideas of most Jews. And Jesus was scathing about the man who spent his whole life building warehouses for his worldly goods and then died without being able to take any of them with him. And it's that lovely saying that emphasizes this conclusion, the camel going through the eye of a needle. The Jews did already have a saying about the elephant going through the eye of a needle. Obviously, you can't. It's just a joke. But Jesus turned it into camel because the Jews would often have seen these camel trains of merchants and of the rich carrying all their wealth on the backs of those camels. So a camel through the eye of a needle made much more sense for them when Jesus used the saying. And Jesus wasn't against rich people. When he met the rich young ruler, he didn't despise him. Mark says he loved him. He even offered to let him be a disciple. He said, "Follow me," but only after he'd distributed his wealth to the poor. In contrast, Zacchaeus, who offered to give away half his wealth, Jesus responded to him, "Today salvation has come to your house, not when you finished giving away your wealth." Jesus presumably saw that the rich young ruler had a different and corrupting relationship to his wealth, and so he made this difficult demand that he give it all up. And in the early church, there were rich members as well as poor. Uh, they could inadvertently cause difficulties when everyone met together. Because at Corinth, for example, when they all met for their agape meal, it appears that the rich people brought food which they didn't share with the poor people. The poor people had to eat their own rather un, uh, unappetizing fare. Or in James's church, the rich got the good seats, or perhaps the only seats. However, the rich also contributed to the church. Paul himself was helped by patrons such as Phoebe in Romans 16, and Philemon, the owner of the slave Onesimus, who, like many others, was thanked for hosting a church in your house. They must have been wealthy people. And right at the church, start of the church, when Jerusalem congregation was bulging with converted Jewish pilgrims who had come for the festival of Pentecost and had stayed when they heard about Jesus, they now needed support, and many people gave generously. Although, of course, some people like Annas and Sapphira only pretended to be generous. And the Acts and the Epistles mirror Jesus' teaching, often pointing out the dangers of money. They point out the dangers of the love of money rather than regarding money itself as dangerous. And James and Peter warn about the dangers of greed for wealth and luxury. And Paul expressed it in the most horrifying way for Jews by pairing greed or covetousness or the longing for to have more. He compared it to idolatry, the worst of all sins in the Bible for Jews. And that highlights Jesus' warning that we should not serve, we should not worship money, mammon, instead of God. So the New Testament has a nuanced and consistent message about money, which was at the time new and somewhat poorly understood. And the consistent teaching about this new technology was that, like the rest of this world, it can be used for good or for ill, especially when it's hoarded and loved. And I just want to end with a personal note that probably won't appear in the published paper. Much of my wage bill as a research fellow was paid for by Sir John Lang. He's the UK building contractor who made a fortune building the early motorways and power stations in this country. And he lived simply and carefully distributed his money to causes that benefited the gospel in the most efficient ways. And one of his beneficiaries was Tyndale House in Cambridge, where I worked, and which transformed the academic world of Bible scholarship, often on a shoestring budget. One of my jobs was to repair computers that broke down, and I repaired them at least twice before replacing them. That sort of thing appealed to Sir John, who was always very careful to use money for the kingdom and get the maximum out of it. And when Sir John died, his executors found he had £316 to his credit. That's all. He had earned millions and he had given it all away. According to Jesus, he'll have a treasure house of friends in heaven. Thank you.